And as I'm speaking to you from Auckland on the other side of the ditch, I should say kia ora tātou, which means not only hello, but hello everyone. Very glad to have you with us here for the presentation and hopefully some discussion that will follow by my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Mani, on the subject of a brutal business, that business being, of course, politics. And we're going to hear today how strategic communication was used by different sides in the recent federal election. And what we're going to hear is also innovative in that it's the first time that particular strategic communication insights are going to be applied to the messaging that went back and forth during what was, I think we'd all agree, a pretty rough and tumble, brutal campaign. So we will take questions as we go through, and if you post things on the chat, then we'll pick those up, and Jim can either respond to them at the time or later on at the end. But I hope that you'll not only enjoy today's discussion, but take away some learnings from it, particularly on how to apply strategic communication models to contemporary events like the election. Jim, of course, is the author of a book on strategic communication, as well as other works. So thanks very much for being our speaker today. Please take it away.
Thanks, excuse me, thanks very much, Chris, and welcome to everybody from Ngunnawal country, the beautiful Canberra. And I recognise the Indigenous owners of this land, their elders, past, present and future. A brutal business. Let me share the screen and we'll get on with it. If it'll work. This is really a preliminary analysis of what I was trying to do when I started this project. It's preliminary because there's only about 77, as of this morning, only about 77% of the votes in the House of Representatives counted. Plus, I have not dealt with the Senate, despite the fact that there's a really, really interesting little case study on one of the Senate seats in Canberra, which, if this does get to be a book, will be a beaut little sidebar. Still to come in the counting are the results of pre-poll voting, postal voting and COVID phone voting. You'll remember that a lot of people pre-polled. We don't yet know the precise number of those who voted before May 21. It was Scott Morrison who said back in February this year that politics is a brutal business. He was, of course, responding to, in particular, to his deputy Barnaby Joyce, who several years ago said that he wouldn't trust Morrison, that Morrison was a liar, and Barnaby had changed his mind. But it's also about how Morrison was regularly attacked by people from the President of France down to his own Senate backbencher, Fierravanti Wells, who climbed into him on budget night, calling him a liar and how he couldn't be trusted. And it seems as though at the end of the election, Morrison discovered that politics is indeed a brutal business. And if you don't get it right, you get flung out. So how did this start? Well, most election reviews are written by political journalists and politicians. Thus, there are rare mentions of the communication aspects, and then only in broad terms. Media coverage and TV debates are regarded as communication with voters. And that generally involves coverage of the negative news of the day, what the polls are saying, the errors people made, and gotchas from our friends in the media, news media. What have I done? Hit the wrong button. There's never been any theoretical explanation that I can find of why and how voters are motivated to vote the way they do, particularly from a communication perspective. Despite elections being about major issues, politicians seem to assume that voters always decide on the what's in it for me principle. And I think this election, as we'll see as we go on, demonstrated that that's not actually the case, or certainly wasn't in this case. And there is, of course, no book that examines strategic communication approaches in Australia. There has been a number in the United States, but for the life of me, I couldn't find them on several hours of searching, usually about presidential elections. So I began with the three major hypotheses. The first one basically was that the two campaigns would be tactical and that they would diverge from the issues that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition said on the day the election was announced are the issues that the election would be about. The second hypothesis was that issue activation and dynamics theory can explain movements in major party support in opinion polling in the course of the campaign. In previous years, the number of undecided voters decreased rapidly the closer we got to the election. Did that happen this time? And that old theory of Kirk Hallahan's 5 publics model can explain how voters participate in elections. It occurred to me the other day that Hallahan is a model that hasn't been, again, I haven't been able to find, I should say, Hallahan's model being applied in any particular situation. But it also seems that you could use that very basic communication model that we all taught in first year to explain what happened in this election. In other words, the pollies forgot about the noise and carried on regardless. So the research project. I wanted to look at the 2022 federal election campaign from a strategic communication perspective, and I had some departure questions. Were the issues raised at the election announcement those that were carried through the campaign? How were the issues framed? Did the campaigns reflect the traditional communication strategy that we know and love and teach? And can Hallahan explain the election result? And there are some secondary questions. Are non-voters Hallahan's inactive or non-publics? And does issue activation theory explain how the undecideds in opinion polls make up their minds? It's interesting, I will propose that issue activation and dynamics theory and Hallahan can be combined to give us a perspective about how non-voters and agnostics, if you like, change their minds. So the traditional communication strategy format's a bit like this. Why is the situation analysis in the big gold circle right in the middle? I would argue and have argued that if you get a situation analysis right, the rest of it falls out of that research easily, and you're more likely to set appropriate goals and objectives, messages, select appropriate target publics, and so on. I'm not today going to get into budget timeline and evaluation, other than to say the big evaluation was that the coalition government lost, and you can't be evaluated more harshly than that. So the problem that strategic communicators face, political strategic communicators, excuse me, face, is that strategy's a mid-term to long-term thing. And if they ever had them, they obviously didn't stick to them. And I wonder whether they actually believe in strategic communication, and I'll argue with you that no, they don't. They actually believe in media communication strategy. This is all about the media as far as so-called political strategic communicators are concerned. So how's it going? A few years ago, many years ago, a wise physicist at the ANU told me that when people start research, they think it's going to be a fairly easy process going from A to B, and that's it, it'll all be over. In fact, it doesn't happen like that. This wise physicist told me it actually happens like this. we meander everywhere and suddenly we get a eureka moment, like Archimedes did. But I'm about at that point in this research, maybe even lower down the green line than that. But that's certainly what happened to me on this. And I got a little bit wrapped up in the actual numbers of the campaign rather than perhaps the communication aspects. So first of all, we need to think about the context in which elections are held and the federal electoral system. As we know, it's the voting system is compulsory enrolment at 18, compulsory voting if you're on the electoral roll. We have a preferential system of voting in the House of Representatives. You must number all the squares, more or less. We have single member divisions and preferences are distributed. The Senate has a similar preferential system, but it's also based on proportional representation, which I think happens in New Zealand, Chris.
It does.
We elect 12 senators from each state, 2 from each territory. Generally, the senators are from a double dissolution, are elected for 6-year terms, and then they decide how half the Senate's going to be turfed out in 3 years' time and face re-elections. The NT and the ACT senators have to be re-elected every 3 years. And there's some complications about voting above or below the line, and the need for senators to be elected on the basis of getting a quota, which is much higher for the territories, and which is what makes the ACT case study so interesting, that in 47 years since we've had senators, there's always been a lab and a lib. And this time round, it looks like the rugby player, David Pocock, is going to roll the lib, the sitting lib. There are usually several campaigns running together. First is a formal thing from the Australian Electoral Commission, which talks about when, where and how to vote correctly, how do you fill out your ballot papers correctly, I should say, and to report results. The other is the political parties, where they have a stoush, where they generally focus on the marginal seats and try to shore up traditional support in safe seats, try to convince swinging and undecided voters to vote for them, and attack the opposition. Just for some numbers, back in 1984, when I worked at the Australian Electoral Commission, running an information campaign which didn't work apparently, the informal vote in the House of Representatives went up to 6.34%. And that was regarded as confusion between the brand new Senate voting system at that election and the traditional House of Representatives voting system. That's when the above the line voting was introduced. In 1993, that fell to nearly 3%. And the previous highest informal vote was back in 1928. So what's happened recently? Well, there hasn't been any survey of the informal ballot in 2019. The Electoral Commission did a different survey then, but this is what happened in 2016. A quarter each of the informal votes were attributed to totally blank ballot papers and incomplete numbering. And the next highest bunch of informal votes were the rude word on the ballot paper thing and scribbles and slogans and just shoving that in. So that suggests that there's a bit of an education thing happening here, needing to happen here, but also that the protest vote has always been with us, but it's been a protest vote which has meant that I don't like any of them. I'm just going to not do it properly and tell them what I think of them. So this is what's happened in the last 7 elections. Just over 11.5 million people missed out on having a say. If you look at the Howard Gillard Rudd era, the non-vote has actually gone up. It was pretty stable between Gillard and Rudd, but the informal vote went up. And I found it interesting when I produced this chart that this almost looks like one of those bar charts showing the coalition and the Labor Party and the opinion polling you know how they kind of mirror one another? Well, this happens here. If I didn't, I decided I'm not going to vote informal, I'm going to vote as a protest vote or not vote at all. That's blank ballot papers and not showing up. So I wonder if that changed in the course of this election. In 2019, this was the categories, or these were the categories of non and informal voting. There were almost 1.5 million people who were enrolled to vote but did not vote. There were nearly 600,000 people who were eligible to be enrolled but not enrolled, and about 600,000 people who voted informal in 2019. So some major electoral issues happen here. Are the non-votes and informal votes protest votes? I'll just move the, I can't. Sorry, I lost my, I was going to change the pictures, but I can't. So do voters enroll but submit blank ballot papers as a protest? Do they vote informally, intentionally as a protest, or do they vote unintentionally, informally? And does that suggest an education stroke information issue? I think that those points become interesting as we look at the election. So the theoretical framework. You'll remember that Hallahan's 5 public models is based on people's knowledge and involvement in an issue, and high-low for both of those axes. And he described inactive, aroused, aware, and active publics and non-publics in this way. You all remember that from your reading. The interesting thing about this theory was that he regarded it as operational in terms of political candidates, which is one of the reasons I grabbed it. So how might we, before the election, categorise Australian voters? Well, those with high involvement in the process or voting are those who actually go and vote, but politicians, rusted on supporters, activists, analysts, and so on. Those with low involvement but high knowledge are people who are interested in politics, they're enrolled to vote, but they're not actually involved in partisan politics, and they might be non-voters, high knowledge about the parties and their policies, but just don't vote. Aroused publics are those who are enrolled and may vote. They may be swinging voters, they're interested in policies that concern them, perhaps they prefer a specific candidate. Those with inactive publics who low knowledge and low involvement don't care about politics. They're enrolled because they have to be. They decide what they're going to do on polling day if they actually turn up. They may cast a donkey vote or they may cast an informal vote. And there are the non-publics who, in my categorisation, are people who have no interest in politics, don't care, they're enrolled because they have to be, they may not be involved and may actually not vote. So how does that work when it comes to Hallahan? I'll just catch up with my notes. Well, I argue that you can look at it this way. As people's knowledge about issues increase, so too does their potential involvement in the election. It works like this. Active publics become voters who may in fact vote formal or informal. That leaves the question of non-voters. Where might they fit on this diagram? Well, we don't really know whether they have high knowledge about issues or low knowledge about issues, but we do know that if they don't vote, they have low involvement in the election. But then there are those non-voters who might go into the polling place and just chuck a blank ballot paper. I would argue that those people have high potential involvement in an election. So all of this started well before the election was called, and I began researching issues and stuff from 6 different news outlets. Why these particular news outlets? They sit on a left to right spectrum. They've got 6 different owners, and there are a variety of issues and approaches which are suggested there. Issues, I started to identify issues that came up during the campaign, and I think I must have, before and after the campaign, I think I must have 1,000 issues, many of which never got addressed in the campaign. I did a bit of a qualitative analysis, which I informed by comms theory, framing, issues, activation, situation theories, and so on, and a quantitative electoral data summary. And I tested all this against traditional communication strategy format. That, of course, because I'm only presenting some preliminary results, that's not really finished. So what about the campaign? Well, on the day it was announced, here's what they said, and you can read those as well as I can. You'll notice that that Mr. Morrison was talking about Labor can't do this, it's focused on politics, it'll weaken the economy, people are tired of politics. They are tradition, and the defence thing, they're traditional opposition issues, government issues. On the other hand, Albanese had a list of what I regarded as positive issues that he would pursue. So let's first of all dispose of the nasty advertising thing. All parties used negative advertising from the start, and indeed some of that negative advertising started towards the end of last year, and certainly before the election was announced this year. Excuse me. So the UAP, for example, was all about shock and horror and don't trust them and we'll do better, and they're all in bed together and they're not in your interests. The Libs played the old, it won't be easy with Albanese and the hole in the budget thing, which I think annoyed people more than anything. And there'll be more taxes and no balanced budgets, and they're all inexperienced, and how are they ever going to run a government? Labor ran on Morrison's integrity. There was one that I saw here quite regularly on telly about no more mistakes, no more excuses, no more Morrison. Remember that during the pandemic, the pandemics, Labor had been pushing, particularly on social media, the argument that he had 2 jobs and he didn't do any of them. And that was all no more mistakes, no more excuses, no more Morrison. But it did appear that Labor appeared to have a much more positive approach to its advertising than anybody else did. And I think that might have been important. So the coalition operated on 4 basic frames. The first one was economic, and they're the words there. The second one was the Kharki election, keep Australia safe, and this was done in the particular context of an uncertain international environment, more defence procurement, worries about the Pacific. They were defensive. Morrison said this wasn't about him, it was about Australians. The government was united. We saved lots of lives with the COVID response, and anyway, we can build a better future together. They had a negative frame which said, hey, we're the people you know, Labor you don't. Labor's too political, people are sick of all that, Labor can't manage money, and Labor will weaken the economy and increase taxes. The opposition had 4 basic frames. One was economic, but we're going to ease cost of living, different from what Morrison was saying, more affordable housing, cheaper childcare and power, fix the national broadband office. They had an integrity frame. We're ready to accept responsibility and we're ready for office. And we'll bring in a strong national integrity commission, often in the frame that Morrison wouldn't do it. They were future oriented, stronger Medicare, more university places, more and free TAFE, implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which I think they're about to start some work on from what I've been reading. And they had obviously a negative frame. The government doesn't have a vision. We'll bring the country together. They want to divide it. We'll end the climate wars. That could have been seen as a positive for them too. And we'll end waste and rorts. So where have I got to? Both more or less stuck to their campaign frames. Labor focused more closely on what I would regard as strategic topics, that is positive and future-oriented topics. The government tended to be negative, defensive, and stressed an uncertain international situation, which is, you know, going right back to the 60s, Reds under the bed, the domino theory and all that. And they keep at that almost every election. I think this time they might have learnt they don't need to do it anymore. The opposition tended to be positive, future-focused, and generally dealt with issues that concern voters, except one, and that was what I've termed the listen to me, and listen to our community issue. Dennis Muller, in the conversation, he's a journalism academic, in the conversation back in January, said, asked the question whether Morrison's media communication strategy failed. This apparently had 4 points. One was maximise his visibility for good news. He disappears when there's bad news. He has direct exposure to friendly media, and he minimises appearing with media who are critical. So both campaigns were seriously tactical. Policy announcements were tactical. I want to get my point of view across about what we're going to do. There were heaps of picture ops, and all this is set up for media coverage. That supports my first hypothesis, but I don't think the campaigns diverged as much as I predicted in that first hypothesis. I think they stuck to the plot a bit more than I thought they would. The campaign actually revealed the real issues: integrity, climate change, cost of living, and that listen to us and our communities, the teal issue. Later stressed the first three, but these were more almost ignored by Morrison and his team. I think the issues, those issues particularly, activated voters, and if you regard, activated voters to get more involved. The shifts to the teal independents and the Greens illustrate that. So the second hypothesis about the role of issues activation and dynamics, issue dynamics theory, was shown, but there was a null part of that hypothesis, and that related to changes in major party support during the course of the campaign. I think the opinion polls appear to have been generally accurate. Something like, towards the end, 24% of undecideds in some polls, and a downturn in the support, primary vote support for the two major parties. And I think that hypothesis 3 was supported, that is that Hallahan's model can indicate why and how there was increased participation and action. But if you pull the Band-Aid off the campaign, both campaigns, you discovered that there's a lot of stuff about integrity, hardly any debate on the real issues, lots of negativity, lots of lies, bracket, UAP, bracket, and others, no real policy debate. And the second televised debate, the one on Channel 9, was actually totally appalling as to describe it as a debate. And I personally think that the first debate, which was on Sky News, in which actual voters, undecided voters, or people who said they were undecided, got to ask Albanese and Morrison questions. There were personal attacks, how people look, etc. Lots of hubris, particularly from the coalition. And there was this continual gotcha business. If you think about the campaign, the first week was basically about Albanese not knowing those economic figures. And I mean, that was wasted, quote, political analysis. So we can have a bit of a think about issue dynamics here. I discovered this a week or so ago, this article a week or so ago, I wish I'd seen it before because I could have used it in lots of other things. This guy is saying that firms, I'm saying political parties and politicians, lose in their reputation for social performance by leading or lagging behind the evolution of societal expectations concerning a given issue. The issues that Teals were interested in, for example, apply there. And if they lag behind on an issue, they lose organisational legitimacy. And I think that explains what happened in this campaign. But how might that work with that issues life cycle that we've all used? I've adapted this from something Max Meng wrote in 2009, and I've changed his final category on this. He says maturity or something as his last. I've changed that to party support because it suits my purposes for the illustration. So as the issue grows in intensity, over time what happens? It gets up to a crisis point from a triggering event, and if it's not resolved in the crisis, party support falls. I think that indicates how the issues applied, debate about issues applied when it comes particularly to the coalition. So what were the triggering events for this, if we were using issues activation? Morrison's integrity. People were sick of hearing about him, perhaps even seeing him. The cost of living argument, the cost of living became a huge issue in the last few weeks. And there was an argument, a useless argument really, about the proposition that the Fair Work Commission might authorise a 5.1 basic wage increase. The government was against that. Albanese was for it. And of course, the criticism of Albanese's decision to support it, if it came about, was that this had wrecked the economy. Machine politics was a triggering event. People were really sick of captain's picks, especially Catherine Deeds, the woman that Morrison selected for the North Sydney, the Warringah seat, Tony Abbott's old seat, and Kennelly, Christina Kennelly, who was, quote, parachuted, unquote, into the Western Sydney seat of Fowler, which has a huge Vietnamese population, and the head office of the Labor Party in New South Wales tossed out the Vietnamese candidate the local Labor Party wanted and parachuted Kennelly in. There were too many gotcha moments, and this brought attention to the role of the news media and commentators. And if I'd had a couple of hours for the talk rather than, I've got about 5 minutes left, I think, there was some great stuff written by journalists criticising the role of the news media and commentators in this gotcha business. The best one was by Malcolm Farr, who used to write for the Daily Telegraph, but I'm not sure who he writes for now, but I got a piece from him in the conversation. And he really excoriated the press gallery for the way in which it played the gotcha moment thing, particularly with Albanese. There were, I believe that a cohort of voters discovered there were alternatives to machine politics of the major parties, the Greens, the Teals and other independents, and the results show that. High vis and stunts, I don't believe that they're really communication tactics, because in this campaign particularly, there was hardly anything meaningful coming out of the mouths of the politicians who engaged in them. And again, the appalling second TV debate were all triggering things that made people, I believe, wake up. So what about the numbers first? I think this is really interesting, and the green numbers here are based on this morning's Electoral Commission website. What's happened here is that the number of people who in 2019 were eligible to enrol but didn't declined by 3.2%. So more people got on the roll, and fewer people decided to vote informal. Fewer people didn't vote informal, which is only an illustration of how these things impacted on their decision to vote. So how does all this work in terms of Hallahan's model? Well, I think that as far as the non-publics are concerned, nothing much changed. If they weren't going to vote, they weren't going to vote, and they don't really care about it. Excuse me. I live in the hay fever capital of the world. Inactive public, the number of inactive publics, given what I've just talked about, decreased. And they were the people who don't know or care about politics, are enrolled because they have to be, decide what they're going to do on polling day, and may either vote informal or do that terrible donkey vote thing. I think the number of aroused publics during the campaign increased, and they were concerned with those trigger issues, fed up with the traditional stuff, and regarded the independents as the solution. And I think they quickly became aware, and active publics. When I say that they regarded the independents as the solution, remember that the Teals stood mostly in coalition seats. And that had those 10 or so Teals who were elected, that had to be a protest against the Libs for what we all thought was, or many of us thought was an issue about the Liberal Party. What about aware publics? Well, the number of non and informal voters decreased. In other words, people became much more aware and decided to act on the trigger issues that concerned them. And I think they voted in a targeted way. The Teals and the Greens and the Independents' increased vote is an illustration of that. Oh, I've gone back. And the number of active publics, that is, people who got in there and voted on issues that matter, increased. The issues were climate change, integrity, the cost of living, and that listen to us. What's the community think about this? What's the community want to do when it comes to pre-selection? And I think they voted against the two-party status quo. Now, how might that work using my previous chart with Hallahan, which I've now turned into one about voter activation, integrity, climate change, the cost of living, and listen to us. And I apologise for using teal bars here, but I thought that was appropriate. I think that's what Hallahan's telling us will happen. As people become more aware and aroused, they become highly active publics and they participate. And a lot of this has got to do with the communication approaches. And I've left the non-voters there because we really don't know what the number of non-voters is, apart from those who were eligible to enrol and didn't enrol. We can get numbers for those who were enrolled but didn't vote. They're the ones who copped the $30 fine. But they're changing. That's changing every day as the count goes on, so it's a bit meaningless. Amanda Dunn from The Conversation had what I thought was a fantastic comment about the election campaign. And I think the fact that it was an unedifying spectacle that had precious little meaningful policy discussion is the actual point about this. And I think that communication failed generally in its support of the major parties. So what lessons do we learn about this? Well, I think that a well-researched situation analysis is essential. This isn't all hard politics. This isn't all hard. Sorry, Chris?
No, sorry, I was just clearing my throat.
Oh, sorry. It's not all hard politics. It's not all about convincing swinging voters in safe electorates or in marginal electorates to vote for you. I think that a proper, the sort of situation analysis that we would do would have picked up the trigger issues far sooner. I think specific target publics really must be identified, and I'm like a broken record on this point. There's no such thing as the general public or simply voters. It's which publics and which voters. Where are the swinging voters? What do they believe? And I think had there been more research done on when the first teals started to appear, on who they were and who's likely to support them and what their concerns were, the two campaigns might have been really different. And therefore, messages must address the issues that concern specific voters. What are they really concerned about, and what will we do about it? I think Labor was probably much better at picking those issues than the communication, than the coalition was. I talk about communication pathways and tools. You probably talk about them as communication strategies and tactics. They're the same thing. I just think pathways and tools are less confusing. And I think that these must match specific voters' normal use of how they like to access information and what tools, social media, the telly, newspapers, SMS messages, need to be matched more carefully, rather than what appears to be this great big spray of information across every outlet and every media. And I think that that after this election particularly, the political parties need to think whether attack advertising actually really works. And I'm not an advertising expert, but I think that that's a question, because I don't think it worked this time. If attack advertising worked, why don't we have a UAP government having spent what, close to 100 million? And are pick ops really useful? Okay, so it gives you the vision of the day, but are they really useful for anything else? I saw during the campaign a couple of photographs, and I wish I'd been able to locate them yesterday when I thought of them again, of Albanese at one place and Tanya Plibersek at another place, standing on the back of a truck talking to people, old-fashioned politics, but recognising that people are who they're supposed to be talking about. And I think my old shop, the Electoral Commission, perhaps needs to think more about the information that is needed for non and informal voters. And by non-voters, I mean those who are eligible to enrol and don't. And that's a very difficult communication task. So in future, perhaps, and I don't hold my breath that it'll happen, media, the much vaunted concentration on the news media through media communication strategies ought to really become media communication tactics, which is what they really are, and recognise as tools that pursue an uncontrolled media pathway. Read a book on writing a communication strategy, and you'll understand that uncontrolled media pathways are simply using the non-paid media, news media. We need to recognise that all of that carry on at big opportunities, flipping hamburgers and driving big trucks and doing all that, are really an interpersonal communication pathway, but you've got to say something, you've got to be meaningful about it. I think there needs to be more communication in areas rather than marginal seats. As part of the, quote, political strategy, you often hear about the marginal seat strategy. Which seats are we going to go to, and try to convince people to vote for us. I think the teal thing and the independent thing, and indeed the green success, indicates that political parties have got to communicate more outside marginal seats. And I think communication strategy planning for the 2025 election should begin now, or certainly after both parties have done their postmortems. And there's a special gotcha for the news media. They should learn now that it's not about how clever journalists are. It's about generating a coverage of news and trying to get some kind of reasonable debate about those issues. And I think that the television stations, particularly those that had the debates, have got to understand that too. I thought that the Channel 9 debate, the panel on the Channel 9 debate, Chris Uhlmann got very upset about the criticism in letters to the editor about this, but I thought the panel was pretty bad too. Silly questions and attempts at gotchas. So thank you, that's it. And I'm about 5 minutes longer than I thought I'd do.
You've done very well, Jim, so thank you very much for that. I wonder whether you think, you've talked a lot about media communication strategy, and I'm keen to hear questions from those who are watching along with us. But there is one thing that occurred to me which I'd like to put to you. You talked about having a reasonable debate. Do you think that today's media, and when I use the word media, I mean media of all types, have abandoned any attempt at reasonable debate by and large, and are just interested in just short grabs, headlines, gotchas, as you say, and it's pretty hard to find the kind of logical, rational debate that some of us at least would like to see. I
think you're right. I think, though, that this is part of the now hackneyed 24-hour news cycle, having to come up with something new all the time. It in fact always was a 24-hour news cycle. Gotcha questions, avoiding some real analysis about the policies that both sides are pushing is hard, in the so-called 24-hour news cycle, and particularly for television. I think they've got to have pretty pictures, high-vis vests and hard hats, rather than someone being questioned in a hard way. The other thing that I think happens more in election campaigns than in ordinary media is that they never ask the why question. They always ask leading questions. So instead of saying, Mr. Albanese, why did you forget those numbers, and forcing him to come up with an excuse, they just keep at him. It's trying to embarrass him even more. I think too that there is too much, that last gotcha. It's not about how clever journalists should be, and it can be, and it's not about what journalists think. I remember going back to the election which John Howard won, when he had a small target strategy. He announced some policy somewhere around the country, and there was a lot of jumping up and down by political commentators that, it was sort of sprung on them. And Michelle Grattan, Australian icon of political journalism, wrote, "Journalists weren't told." Well, where in the name of any law does it say journalists must be told all this stuff? And so I think there's a kind of journalistic arrogance, if you like, which prevents them from covering the debate the way it should be covered. And there's that pressure to get the news story, which is usually a negative. Yes, indeed it is. And we see that, don't we, online, when you read analyses of online commentaries and find that the major platforms have algorithms that promote negative terminology ahead of more neutral or positive terminology. But that's enough from me. I'd like to hear from others who've been.
Yeah, we've got a question here from Alistair. He says, do you have a sense of whether influence is moving from mainstream media, especially Murdoch media, to social media or elsewhere?
I think I think social media is more influential. I don't share the view everything's about social media. I regard social media as a communication tool to be used in appropriate circumstances for appropriate target publics. But I think it's becoming increasingly more important, if you want to put that in inverted commas. I think the influence of the Murdoch media is declining, despite the attempts of papers like the Melbourne Sun Pictorial and the Sydney Daily Telegraph to change people's minds. I think what happened in this election is that there were more people who were thinking about what ought to happen, rather than, scare tactics like Albo will tax you more. I think that, I hope that makes sense.
Jim, I think pretty much anything you say obviously makes sense. There's a question here from Thomas Park saying, is there anything to suggest that Hallahan's aroused public are actually aroused not to vote?
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that some people just don't care about politics. Some people care about politics and get so annoyed with what they see happening that they just turn off and they won't vote. This is not the context in which to add it into the research I'm trying to do, but I often think that the way the coalition went about Dorothy Dix's must turn people off who watch Question Time. Every Dorothy Dixer begins the same way. Mr. Speaker, my question is, does the minister agree with me? That kind of introduction. When I worked in the press gallery, it wasn't like that. It was tough. People got stuck into you. And now it does, even your own backbench. But now it's more, the Dorothy Dixer has become far more Dorothy. And I think that turns people off. And yes, Tom, I think it arouses them to not vote in many cases.
Can I suggest if you want to see vigorous question times, you have a look at Question Time in the New Zealand Parliament. We are more, there is more rough and tumble there than you might expect. But interesting stuff. There's a question from Leanne Glennie. Do you think that when political parties, politicians and journalists reflect on this latest campaign, they will consider these types of communication issues or look for others to blame for their shortcomings?
Sadly, Leanne, I don't. I remember being told by an academic who described themselves as a political communicator and who had been a press secretary for a minister, that the job of press secretary, now called strategic communication advisor, remember, or media advisor, was not just to get the minister coverage, but to be able to do things like fundraising. And, I think that politicians think that the only way that you can get your story across is to implement some kind of media tactic. Irrespective of whether we agree with two-step flow and media effects theory and all of that, we still are not convinced that people who use a mass communication pathway are actually getting their messages across. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that might happen, including the media gatekeepers. But the journalists, particularly those in the press gallery, make it much more difficult for politicians to think about stronger, real strategic communication because they keep writing about, the media was told this and it was a media conference and he said at a media conference and blah, blah, blah. And I suppose deep down in my heart, I think that too much of politics is determined by what, quote, the media, unquote, might do and cover. So, Leanne, I'm pessimistic.
In a sense, you're saying that not only do the media help to set the agenda for publics to think about, but they also help set the agenda for what the politicians talk about.
Yeah. It's this belief that look, getting the media to cover you is a really cheap way of, quote, communicating, unquote. But is it really communicating, or is it just blurting stuff out, getting a coverage, and the ministers can say, look, there I am on page 3 of the Sydney Morning Herald, with a pic, isn't it great? And I had my picture on my high vis and hard hat on the telly last night. But that doesn't prove anything.
I like to tell students that exposure does not equate to influence.
Yes, exactly.
But there is a question from Shelley Edison Bell. Did you include in your study any new or emerging communication tools or methods? Are press stand-ups still engaging to the public and media?
I haven't yet used emerging stuff, because mainly concentrating on those 6 outlets that I talked about, and they're all either online, well, they're online, but or they're the traditional media. Sorry, the last part interested me. Let me just have a look at that question again.
Are press stand-ups still engaging to the public and media?
I think they're absolutely engaging to the media. It's a cheap way of getting a picture. It's a cheap way of getting the lead of the day for whatever news story you're writing. But I doubt that they engage the public that much, really. But people don't say anything in that, and we got to remember that the way the media operates is that whatever you say in your stand-up doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be what the media says the next day.
No, indeed. We're almost out of time, but I wonder if we could fit in a last question. Anyone else want to ask something? One of the things on my mind, of course, I know we've been talking about the Australian federal election, but is the role of, if you like, celebrity politicians like our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who's in the US at the moment, and to what extent a perceived celebrity status, either celebrity for either good or not so good reasons, can influence the way that communication happens.
Celebrity element to this is going back to 2007 with our, at the time, a celebrity factor with Kevin Rudd, Kevin 07.
Yes.
I think that's no longer celebrity status. It's gone a long time ago, but yeah.
Celebrity can be very fragile and ephemeral thing, can't it?
But
and I think it worked. It seemed to work a bit against Albanese. Yeah.
Rudd, of course, it was a celebrity before he became leader of the opposition. He was well known for on any given issue ringing up, ABC Radio National's breakfast program and saying, "Do you want to comment on such and such?" "Oh yeah, sure." Click. Here's Kevin Rudd going to tell us about it. He did that so often. Thanks for having me. All the time, so he was a celebrity before he got to be leader of the opposition, and I suppose that's why he resonated with people, because they were used to hearing him.
Absolutely. Got a bouquet from Joe Kirkpatrick to everyone. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.
I would fully endorse that. Thanks again to you, Jim, and to everyone who's participated. I see we're bang on 1 o'clock your time, and it must be time for lunch on the other side of it. So I encourage you to keep connecting with these sorts of discussions. I've certainly found this one very interesting, and the kind of work that you're doing, Jim, fascinating, and look forward to more.
Thank you.
For
Thank
everyone,
you. Thank
enjoy
you
the
for
rest of your
hosting.
day and the upcoming weekend.
See ya.
Thanks very much.